Marry her, or I'll have your deed signed over to me before the rooster crows tomorrow." Calvin Pierce said it the way a man orders a hanging. Casual. Final. Like Wyatt Hayes' entire life was just a number on a ledger he was tired of looking at. Wyatt stood there with mud on his boots and 2 days of grief on his face, and the name of his dead wife was already burning a hole in his chest before Pierce even finished the sentence. He didn't answer. He didn't move. He just stared at the man across that desk and understood for the first time exactly what kind of evil wore a clean suit. And Pierce smiled like he'd already won. If this story already has your heart, hit that subscribe button, ring the notification bell, and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to 1887 Texas, where two strangers are about to be forced into a marriage neither of them wants, and where the woman this whole town called unwanted is about to become the only person worth fighting for. Part 1. The Wedding That Felt Like a Funeral. The deal Pierce laid out was simple, the way a rattlesnake strike is simple. Wyatt Hayes owed $430 on the ranch mortgage money borrowed during a brutal winter 2 years back when the cattle died in waves, and Clara was still alive, and they both believed next season would turn things around. Clara didn't live to see next season. And next season brought nothing but more debt and a 6-year-old daughter who cried every night for a mother who wasn't coming back. Pierce's man had shown up at the ranch 3 weeks earlier with a payment notice. Wyatt had asked for 60 days. Pierce's man had smiled and said he'd pass the message along. What Pierce passed along instead was a summons to his office. "I'm a reasonable man, Hayes," Pierce said, leaning back in his chair, like a man who had never been refused anything in his life. "I don't enjoy foreclosing on a widow's ranch, especially with a child involved. It's bad for my reputation. Then give me the 60 days. "I already gave you 60 days, 8 months ago. Pierce tapped the edge of his desk with one finger, slow and deliberate. "What I'm offering now is something far more valuable than time. I'm offering you a solution." "What solution?" Pierce opened a drawer and slid a single piece of paper across the desk. Wyatt didn't touch it. "Eleanor Graves," Pierce said. "School teacher, 30 years old. Lives alone on the edge of town in her father's old house. Father died last spring, left her nothing but books and a reputation for being difficult." He paused. "The school board has been looking for a reason to let her go for 2 years. They've finally found one. An unmarried woman of her age, they say, is a moral concern. Bad influence on the children." Wyatt stared at him. "What does any of that have to do with my ranch? She needs a husband to save her position." Pierce's voice didn't change. Flat, businesslike. "And you need a wife to consolidate the ranch debt under a joint household contract, which I happen to be prepared to offer at half the current interest rate with a 3-year grace period." The room went very quiet. "You want me to marry a woman I've never spoken to," Wyatt said slowly, "to solve a debt problem you created." "I want you to make a practical decision," Pierce said, "before sentiment gets your daughter put out on the street." That word daughter landed like a boot on a throat. Wyatt looked at the paper on the desk. He didn't pick it up. "What happens if I say no?" Pierce smiled again. It was the same smile, the one that never moved his eyes. "Then I file the foreclosure papers tomorrow morning, and by next week someone else is running cattle on your land. Someone more cooperative." He stood buttoning his jacket. "Think it over tonight, but don't think too long." Wyatt rode home in the dark. He didn't tell anyone what Pierce had offered. Not the ranch hands. Not his foreman, old Calhoun, who had worked the Hayes land for 20 years and would have lit Pierce's office on fire with his bare hands if he knew. Wyatt sat on the porch of the house Clara had loved and looked out at land that had been in his family since before he was born, and he thought about his daughter asleep inside. Lily was 7 now, small for her age, quiet in a way that broke his heart with her mother's dark eyes and the habit of carrying her rag doll everywhere, because she said it still smelled like Mama. He couldn't lose this ranch. He couldn't uproot that child from the only home she'd ever known and watch her lose the last piece of her mother she had left. He went inside, poured himself 2 fingers of whiskey, didn't drink it, and sat at the kitchen table until the sky started going pale. Then he saddled his horse and rode into town. 9. Eleanor Graves was already awake. She was always awake before dawn. It was a habit from childhood, from the years when her father would rise early to write, and she would sit across from him with a book so she wouldn't feel alone. He'd been gone 7 months now, and she still woke before the sun out of pure muscle memory. Still made 2 cups of coffee before she remembered. She was at her kitchen table with a stack of papers when she heard the knock. Not the school board again. Not at this hour. She opened the door. The man on her porch was tall, weathered, and looked like he hadn't slept in a week. She didn't know his name at first. She knew his face, the way you know any face in a small town from a distance, from across the street, from context. He was the Hayes widower, the one with the little girl. She'd seen him at church 3 or 4 times, always standing slightly apart from everyone else, the way grief makes a person into an island. "Miss Graves," he said. "Mr. Hayes," she answered, because she'd figured it out by then. He looked at her for a moment like he was trying to find words he hadn't rehearsed. "I know this is going to sound like the worst thing you've ever heard," he said finally. "And I need you to know that I am not the kind of man who would come to a woman's door at dawn if I had any other option." Eleanor crossed her arms. Not defensive, just watching. "Then say what you came to say." He said it, all of it. Pierce's deal, the debt, the mortgage, the foreclosure threat. He didn't dress it up or soften the edges. He stood on her porch in the cold morning air and laid it out plain the way a man does when he's too tired to be anything but honest. When he finished, Eleanor didn't speak right away. "You're asking me to marry you," she said. "To save your ranch?" "Yes." "And you'd be doing it to save my position at the school?" "That's what Pierce said." She was quiet for a long moment. Long enough that Wyatt thought she was going to close the door in his face, which he would have understood completely. Instead, she said, "Did Pierce come to you, or did you go to him?" The question surprised him. "He summoned me." "Did he suggest my name specifically?" "Yes." She said nothing. But something shifted behind her eyes. Something sharp and calculated that Wyatt didn't expect to see on the face of a woman who was supposed to be just a lonely schoolteacher. "Give me until noon," she said. "I need an answer by," I said noon. She said it the way she probably said things to students who talked back. Calm, absolute. "Come back then." And she closed the door. What Wyatt didn't know, what nobody in that town knew yet, was that Eleanor Graves had been waiting for exactly this kind of pressure. Not the marriage part. She hadn't been waiting for that. But Calvin Pierce. She'd been watching Calvin Pierce for 14 months. It started the autumn before her father died. Her father, Thomas Graves, had been a land surveyor for 30 years. Precise man. Honest man. The kind of man who kept copies of everything in leather-bound journals that he stored in a locked chest under his bed. When he got sick, he called Eleanor to his bedside and handed her a key. "Don't open that until after I'm gone," he'd said. "And when you do, be careful who you trust." The journals were full of survey records, boundary markings, property lines going back 15 years across 3 counties. And buried in the back of the last journal in her father's cramped handwriting was a list of names. Ranchers who had sold their land under pressure. Families who had moved on suddenly. Properties whose boundary lines had shifted slightly, just slightly after the original survey was filed before the county recorder got the final paperwork. Calvin Pierce's name appeared on every single one. Eleanor had been a schoolteacher, not a lawyer, but she was her father's daughter, and her father had taught her to read a survey map the way other fathers taught their sons to read a sky for weather. She understood what she was looking at. She just didn't know yet what to do about it. Coming to the county sheriff was useless. She'd tried. He'd smiled and offered her tea. Going to the newspaper editor had gotten her 3 sentences in a column about local concerns buried under an advertisement for saddle soap. She had the records. She had the evidence. What she didn't have was access, the kind of access that came with a last name people respected, and a position that gave her standing in a room where decisions were made. She had 14 months of careful, quiet documentation. And Calvin Pierce had just handed her the door she needed to walk through. "Darap ko," When Wyatt came back at noon, Eleanor was sitting at her kitchen table with a piece of paper already written out. Not a love letter, not a list of conditions, a business agreement. 2 pages clear and precise covering shared ownership of property, financial arrangements, separate living quarters, and a clause about the school position that she'd worded carefully enough that no board member could challenge it. She slid it across the table to him. He read it, twice. "You wrote this morning," he said. "I wrote most of it 3 months ago," she said. "I've been expecting something like this." He looked up at her. "Expecting what exactly?" "Pressure," she said. "Pierce puts pressure on people when they have something he wants. I have something he wants gone, my father's surveying records. He just hasn't figured out yet that I know that." Wyatt set the paper down slowly. "What are you talking about?" "I'll explain everything," she said. "But not today. Today I need to know one thing." She met his eyes directly. "If we do this, if we go through with this arrangement, are you a man who keeps his word?" It was the bluntest thing anyone had asked him in years. "Yes," he said. "Then sign it." He signed it. The wedding announcement went up in the general store window 2 days later. The reaction was immediate, and it was ugly. By the time Eleanor walked through town that afternoon, the whispers had already hardened into something louder. She heard it from 3 feet away, from women she'd taught alongside for years, from men who tipped their hats and then turned to say what they really thought as soon as her back was passed. She must have done something to convince him. Poor man doesn't know what he's getting into. Always knew she'd trap somebody eventually. Desperation makes women dangerous. Eleanor kept walking, head up, spine straight. She'd been hearing variations of this her entire adult life, and she had long ago decided that dignity was not something you protected by flinching. But it still hit somewhere she didn't show. At the dry goods store, the owner's wife, a woman named Harriet, looked at Eleanor over the counter with barely concealed pity and said, "I suppose congratulations are in order. Though I do wonder, does Mr. Hayes know what he's agreeing to?" Eleanor set her basket down on the counter. "Mrs. Harriet," she said pleasantly, "what he's agreeing to is a woman who can run a household, manage accounts, teach a child to read, and stitch a wound without fainting. If that concerns you, I understand completely." She paid for her flour and walked out before the woman could answer. Wyatt had his own gauntlet to run. His foreman Calhoun cornered him in the barn the morning after the announcement. "Tell me you didn't agree to this," Calhoun said. He was 60 years old, missing 2 fingers on his left hand, and had the moral conviction of a man who had buried 3 friends at 30 and decided life was too short for nonsense. "Tell me somebody put a gun to your head." "It's done, Cal." "Wyatt, the ranch stays." Wyatt didn't look up from the saddle he was cleaning. "Lily stays in her home. That's all I care about right now." Calhoun was quiet for a moment. Then, "You don't even know this woman." "No. I've heard things about her. People say she's cold, difficult, that she drove off every decent man who ever looked at her." Wyatt finally looked at him. "Decent men in this town tend to be the ones doing the most talking and the least thinking. I'll make my own judgments." Calhoun stared at him for a long moment, then sighed, the deep sigh of a man who knows he's already lost an argument. "You're going to need to at least tell her about Clara," he said quietly. "She deserves to know what she's walking into." Wyatt didn't answer, but the name settled into the hollow of his chest the way it always did. Clara. 2 years gone and still the loudest thing in every room he walked into. The wedding was on a Thursday. The church was full, which said nothing about goodwill and everything about the human appetite for spectacle. Eleanor arrived without family. Her father was gone. She had no siblings, and the 2 women she'd considered close friends had quietly distanced themselves the moment the marriage became public. She arrived alone, and she walked that aisle alone. And she did it with a level of composure that made at least 3 people in the pews genuinely uncomfortable because they'd been hoping to see her crumble. Wyatt was already at the altar when she came in. He turned when the doors opened, and for a second, just a fraction of a second, something crossed his face that Eleanor couldn't read. Not disgust, not the cold indifference she'd braced for. Something more complicated. Something that looked almost like recognition. Like a man looking at someone who understood something the rest of the room didn't. The minister began the words. They were both looking straight ahead. "Do you, Wyatt James Hayes, take this woman?" Wyatt said, "Yes, the way a man signs a contract. Clean. Committed." "Do you, Eleanor Ruth Graves, take this man?" Eleanor said yes, the way a woman plants a flag. Then the minister instructed the groom to take the bride's hand. Wyatt reached for her hand, and she reached for his at the same moment. Not hesitant, not trembling, just moving at the same instant he moved, and their fingers met with a precision that had nothing romantic about it, and somehow still felt like something. He was cold. She was cold. The church was warm. Neither of them noticed any of that. "You may..." "Don't," Eleanor said quietly, just barely loud enough for Wyatt to hear. He turned to look at her. She was looking straight ahead. "We don't need to do that part," she said under her breath. Steady, matter of fact. Wyatt looked back at the minister, who was blinking uncertainly. "I believe my wife is right," Wyatt said, and that was that. Calvin Pierce was sitting in the third pew. Wyatt noticed him on the way back down the aisle. Pierce nodded once, the nod of a man checking a box on a list. Satisfied. Done. Eleanor didn't look at Pierce, but her hand tightened very slightly on Wyatt's arm. He felt it, and he filed it away. The ride back to the ranch was quiet. They sat on the wagon bench with 8 inches of space between them, and the afternoon spread out wide and empty, and neither of them spoke for most of it. Not awkwardly. Just, there was nothing that needed saying yet. Lily was waiting on the porch when they pulled up. Wyatt had told his daughter the night before, as gently as he could. He'd sat on the edge of her bed with her doll in her lap and told her that a woman named Miss Eleanor was going to come live with them, and that this didn't mean anything was going to change, and that Miss Eleanor was going to be very kind, and that Lily didn't have to feel any kind of way about it. Lily had looked at him with those dark eyes of hers and said, "Is she nice?" And Wyatt had realized, sitting there, that he had absolutely no idea. "I think so," he'd said. Lily had considered this very seriously. Then she'd picked up her doll and said, "Okay." Now she stood on that porch, small and straight, watching the wagon pull in. Eleanor climbed down before Wyatt could help her, not rudely, just independently, and she walked to the bottom of the porch steps and looked up at the child. "You must be Lily," she said. Lily stared at her. "Papa said you teach school." "I do." "Do you give a lot of homework?" Eleanor considered this with complete seriousness. "Only the important kind." "What's the important kind?" "The kind you can't find in a book," Eleanor said. "The kind you figure out by watching things." Lily looked at her for another long moment. Then she stepped back and said, "You can come in if you want." Wyatt, standing behind Eleanor, felt something he couldn't immediately name. It wasn't relief. It was more like the sound of a lock you'd forgotten was locked finally clicking open. The house was a battlefield of grief and neglect in ways Wyatt hadn't fully admitted to himself. The accounts were a disaster. He knew that. He'd known it for months, but he'd been holding ranch life together with sheer stubbornness and the refusal to look directly at numbers that frightened him. Clara had handled the accounts. Clara had handled most things that required sitting still and thinking clearly, while Wyatt handled the things that required moving fast and deciding in a split second. That night, after Lily was in bed, Eleanor sat down at the kitchen table with the ranch ledger and started reading. Wyatt watched her from the doorway. She turned pages with the focused calm of a woman who had seen worse, and her expression didn't change much, but her finger stopped on one specific page, and she tapped it twice. "This payment," she said, "October of last year. $412 to sundry expenses." "What does that mean?" Wyatt came into the room, looked over her shoulder. "Pierce's man said it was a service fee, part of the debt restructuring." Eleanor looked at the number, then she looked at the next page, and the next. "There are 6 payments listed like this," she said. "All in the last 18 months. All described as service fees or processing costs, No receipts, no itemization. She looked up at him. "Did you sign anything for these payments?" "I signed what his man put in front of me." "Where are those documents?" "In the strongbox, by the fireplace." She was already standing. Wyatt followed her into the front room. He opened the strongbox and handed her the folder of ranch documents, the mortgage papers, the restructuring agreement, the various notices Pierce's office had sent over 2 years. Eleanor sat down on the floor right there and started reading by the light of the fire, and she read with the kind of focused intensity that reminded Wyatt of no one so much as his daughter when she got hold of a book she couldn't put down. He didn't disturb her. 20 minutes passed. Then Eleanor looked up. "Wyatt," she said. And it was the first time she'd used his first name, though she said it the same way she said everything direct, without extra weight. "These fees don't appear in the original mortgage contract. They were added in an amendment that's signed with your name, but the handwriting on the amendment document is different from your signature on the original." He stared at her. "What does that mean?" She held up the papers. "It means," she said quietly, "that someone forged your signature, twice, and added debt to your account that you never actually agreed to." She paused. "This isn't just predatory lending. This is fraud." The word landed in the room like a stone dropped down a well. Wyatt looked at the documents. He looked at Eleanor. The fire crackled. "How do you know about forgery?" he said slowly. She looked at him steadily, and then she made a decision. He could see it happen, could see her weighing something and then settling it. "Because," she said, "my father spent 30 years watching Calvin Pierce do things like this, and I've spent the last 14 months writing all of it down." She reached into the inside pocket of her jacket, the same practical jacket she'd worn to the wedding, and pulled out a folded set of papers that she'd carried there all day. She unfolded them on the floor between them. Land surveys, boundary records, a list of names, dates, numbers. Wyatt looked at the papers, then at her. "You knew about this before you agreed to marry me," he said. "Yes." "You knew Pierce was trying to set something up." "I suspected, yes." He sat back on his heels. The fire was warm. The house was quiet. Outside, the Texas night was making its sounds. "So when you wrote up that business agreement this morning," he said, "I needed to know if you were someone I could trust," she said. "If you weren't, I'd have said no and taken my chances with the school board. And if I was, then we'd both have something to work with." Wyatt looked at her. This woman he'd married 6 hours ago. This woman the whole town had spent years dismissing. This woman sitting on his floor with forged mortgage papers in one hand and 14 months of evidence in the other. And he felt something shift in his chest that he did not want to examine too closely. "What do we do with this?" he said. Eleanor folded the papers carefully and tucked them back in her jacket. "Not yet," she said. "Pierce has eyes everywhere. If we move too soon, he'll bury it." She stood up. "We need more, and we need the right people." "What people?" She looked at him. "The other ranchers he's done this to," she said. "Your neighbors. The families that sold and moved away. Some of them didn't go far. They're still out there." She picked up the ranch ledger. "And we're going to find them." She set the ledger on the table, closed it, and looked at Wyatt Hayes with the steady gaze of a woman who had been planning this for over a year and had finally found someone standing on the same side. "I'm going to bed," she said. "Second door on the left." "Yes." She nodded once, walked down the hall. The door closed. Wyatt stood in the middle of his kitchen in the house that had been too quiet for 2 years, with forged mortgage documents on his table, and the ranch ledger beside them, and the sound of a woman's footsteps settling into the room where no one had slept since Clara. He stood there for a long time. Then he sat down at the table and started reading. Wyatt was still at the table when the sun came up. He hadn't meant to stay there all night. He'd meant to read through the documents for an hour, then sleep. But the more he read, the less sleep seemed possible. Because Eleanor hadn't just identified 2 forged signatures. Once he knew what to look for once, He understood what those fraudulent amendment clauses actually meant. He found 3 more buried in the restructuring agreement Pierce's man had walked him through 18 months ago, speaking fast and confident and handing pages over one at a time like a dealer laying cards. Wyatt had signed everything. Because Clara had just died. Because Lily wouldn't stop crying. Because the cattle count was down 40%, and he couldn't hold 2 numbers in his head at the same time without one of them falling out. Pierce had known exactly when to come. He set the papers down when he heard movement in the kitchen. He assumed it was Calhoun coming in early. He turned around, and it was Eleanor already dressed. Her hair pinned back, pouring coffee from the pot she'd apparently started herself without making any noise about it. She set a cup in front of him without asking. "You found more," she said. It wasn't a question. 3 more clauses, Amendment 2 Section 4, and 2 places in the restructuring agreement where the margin notes don't match the original language. She sat down across from him and pulled the papers toward her. She read quickly the way she read everything, with her finger moving just slightly along each line tracking. "The margin notes are his handwriting," she said. "My father documented Pierce's handwriting in his journals. I can cross-reference." She turned the page. "This one here, this fee for legal processing, this maps directly to a payment my father recorded in October of '85 on the Alderman property. Same language, same amount, different name on the deed." Wyatt watched her. "Your father, how long did he know about Pierce?" Eleanor didn't look up. "Long enough that it killed him." The words were quiet, not dramatic, just placed down plainly the way you put down something heavy you've been carrying too long. "He got sick," she said. "But he'd been under pressure for 2 years before that. Pierce's men came to his office 3 times. Told him his survey records were creating confusion in the county filings. Asked him to amend certain boundary records." She turned another page. He refused. And then his license renewal ran into unexpected complications, and then his biggest client stopped calling. Wyatt said nothing. "He died believing that nobody would ever do anything about it," Eleanor said, "because Pierce had spent years making himself untouchable." She looked up. "I intend to prove him wrong." There was nothing soft about the way she said it. No tremor. No request for sympathy. Just a woman who had made a decision a long time ago and had been executing it ever since. Wyatt picked up his coffee cup. "We need the Alderman family," he said. "Yes." Dan Alderman moved his family to Clover Creek after they sold out, about 40 miles east. Eleanor looked at him. "You know him?" "Bought cattle from him twice. He's a straight shooter. If he knew what Pierce did to his deed, he'd want to know about it." For the first time that morning, something shifted in Eleanor's expression. Not quite a smile, but close. "How soon can you ride there?" she said. Naheng. He didn't ride to Clover Creek that day because that morning brought its own complications in the form of a ranch hand named Decker, who had apparently decided that the new arrangement gave him the right to an opinion. Decker was 24 big and had been hired on 6 months earlier by Calhoun when they were short on men for the fall roundup. He did good work with cattle and poor work with anything requiring courtesy. Eleanor encountered him at the water pump when she went out to get water for the morning wash-up, and Decker was standing there with 2 other hands, and one of them said something Wyatt didn't hear from across the yard, and all 3 of them laughed. Eleanor set her bucket down. "Say it again," she said. Her voice carried perfectly across the yard without her raising it. "If it was worth saying once, say it where everyone can hear." Decker turned around with the easy confidence of a man who had never been checked by a woman in his life. "Just said it's funny watching a school teacher try to figure out which end of a bucket to hold." "I see." Eleanor looked at him for a moment. "What's your name?" "Decker." "Decker. How long have you been on this ranch?" "6 months. And in 6 months have the accounts been filed correctly?" He blinked. "That's not my... Have the feed invoices been cross-checked against delivery receipts? I don't do the... Has anyone inventoried the medical supplies for the horses since September?" A beat of silence. "No," said one of the other hands quietly. The youngest one, barely 18, who had been staring at his boots since the conversation started. "Right," Eleanor said. She picked up her bucket. So when you figure out how to do those things, you can talk to me about the bucket. She walked back toward the house. The feed invoice discrepancy is going to cost this ranch $60 if it isn't corrected by end-of-week Decker. I suggest you think about that. Wyatt had watched the whole thing from 20 feet away. Calhoun appeared at his elbow. Well, the old foreman said in a tone that suggested he was recalculating something. She's not what I thought. No, Wyatt said. She's not. Hank. Lily decided within 48 hours that Eleanor was the most interesting adult she had ever encountered, which was a verdict she arrived at through her own rigorous 7-year-old logic. The evidence she cited in order Eleanor knew the names of every bone in a horse's leg. Eleanor could calculate the feed cost for 12 head of cattle in her head faster than Lily could count to 30. Eleanor had a book about the stars that had pictures of the constellations drawn in the margins by someone named Thomas. My father, Eleanor said simply, and she let Lily hold it with both hands and didn't tell her to be careful. Mama used to read to me, Lily said. She said it the same way she said everything directly the way children do before they learn that some things are supposed to be said carefully. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't offer sympathy or change the subject or do any of the things adults usually did when Lily mentioned her mother, which always made Lily feel like she'd done something wrong by bringing it up. What did she read to you? Eleanor asked. Everything. She liked the ones with animals. Papa doesn't read out loud very well. He goes too fast and skips the good parts. Eleanor turned a page. Should I read this one to you tonight? Lily considered this very seriously. Are you going to skip parts? Never. Okay. Wyatt heard this from the hallway. He didn't walk in. He stood there with his hand on the doorframe and his chest doing something he hadn't asked it to do, and after a moment, he went back to the kitchen and found something to keep his hands busy. On the third day, Wyatt rode to Clover Creek. He found Dan Alderman behind his brother-in-law's fence line fixing a post that had rotted through. Alderman was a compact, sun-darkened man in his 50s with no patience for pleasantries, which suited Wyatt just fine. I need to talk to you about Calvin Pierce, Wyatt said. Alderman's hands went still on the fence post. I got nothing to say about Pierce, he said without turning around. I have documents, Wyatt said. My wife found survey records and mortgage amendments. Forgeries, Dan, with your property boundary records attached. Now Alderman turned around. He looked at Wyatt for a long moment. Something moved behind his face. Old anger, old fear, old grief for the land his family had worked for 16 years before they signed it away for a number that barely covered the debt Pierce had manufactured around their necks. Your wife, Alderman said. That the Graves woman, Thomas Graves's daughter. Yes. Thomas was an honest man. Alderman's jaw worked. Pierce's people told him his survey records were wrong. Told him he'd miscalculated our boundary markers. Thomas came to me personally and told me that was a lie, that the records were correct and that somebody was messing with the county filings. He paused. 2 weeks later, Thomas started having trouble with his license renewal. I know, Wyatt said. Eleanor knows, and she has the original survey records to prove it. The silence that followed was the kind that means a man is deciding something important. How many others? Alderman said finally. We're still counting. Alderman threw the fence tool he was holding into the dirt. Mitchell family, he said. Sold out 4 years ago. They're in Harker's Junction now. The Reyes family, they lost their water rights on a technicality that never made sense, moved west. And Bert Colton. He looked at Wyatt hard. You know Bert Colton? Used to. Pierce has him tied up in a debt agreement he can't get out of. Bert's still on his land, but he's one bad season from losing it. If you go to him, if you show him what you're showing me, he'll talk. Wyatt nodded. Will you? He said. Another long pause. Thomas Graves spent 2 years trying to protect us, Alderman said quietly. Least I can do is not let it be for nothing. He picked up his fence tool. You bring me those documents. I'll sign a statement. The ride back from Clover Creek took Wyatt through town, which was a mistake, though he didn't know it until he was already on the main street and saw the small crowd gathered outside the general store. Not a crowd exactly. 4 men, standing in a loose cluster, the way men do when they're making a point without quite making a threat. And in the middle of it, perfectly still, was Eleanor. She'd gone into town for supplies. She'd come out to find Pierce's attorney, a wiry, sharp-dressed man named Calloway, waiting for her on the steps with 3 men Wyatt recognized as Pierce's ranch foreman, standing just far enough away to be deniable. Wyatt pulled his horse up and stayed mounted. Calloway was speaking in a low, pleasant voice. Mr. Pierce simply wanted to extend his congratulations on the marriage, Mrs. Hayes. He also wanted to pass along a friendly concern. He's heard that certain private family documents may have gone astray after your father's passing. Documents that belong to the county records office. My father's survey journals are personal property, Eleanor said. They were bequeathed to me, as his daughter. It's in his will, which was filed with the county clerk in March. Of course, of course. Calloway smiled the same way Pierce smiled, with no heat behind it. Mr. Pierce is simply concerned about any confusion that might arise if private records were misinterpreted by someone without the proper legal or technical background. You mean someone like a school teacher, Eleanor said. I didn't say that, but that's what you meant. Eleanor looked at Calloway with the steady patience of a woman who had been underestimated by men in good suits her entire professional life and had stopped finding it surprising. Tell Mr. Pierce that my father's records are safely stored. Tell him that I have a thorough technical background in land surveying. As it happens, my father taught me personally from the age of 12. And tell him that if he has concerns about county records, he's welcome to file an inquiry with the county clerk's office like everyone else. Calloway's smile didn't change, but his eyes did. Mrs. Hayes, he said, I'd encourage you to think carefully about the position you're putting yourself in. You're new to this role, new to this household. A woman in your situation can't afford to make powerful enemies. Eleanor looked at him. Mr. Calloway, she said, I've been making powerful enemies since I was 30 years old and told the school board that children of ranch workers deserve the same education as the banker's son. I am not new to this. She picked up her basket. Good afternoon. She walked to her wagon. She climbed up without help. She drove away. Calloway stood on that step for a moment. Then he looked up and noticed Wyatt on his horse across the street. Their eyes met. Calloway looked away first. Wyatt rode after the wagon. When he caught up, Eleanor was driving with both hands on the reins, and her jaw set, and she didn't look at him when he pulled up alongside. You heard that, she said. Yes. I'm not going to apologize for what I said. I didn't ask you to. A pause. The wagon wheels turned. He's scared, Eleanor said. Calloway doesn't come out personally unless Pierce is scared, which means Pierce already suspects I have the journals. She flicked the reins. We need to move faster than I planned. Alderman will sign a statement, Wyatt said. She looked at him then, finally. How many more can we get? Alderman says Colton and the Mitchell family. Maybe the Reyes if we can reach them. Eleanor was quiet, calculating. 4 families with signed statements. The forged documents from our mortgage. My father's journals. She nodded slowly. It might be enough, if we can find the right person to take it to. Federal Marshal, Wyatt said. Not the county sheriff. No, not the county sheriff. She paused. Do you know anyone? My uncle served with a marshal named Holt out of the Austin district. Honest man. I haven't spoken to him in 3 years, but he'd remember the name. Write to him tonight, Eleanor said. Don't use the town post office. Wyatt looked at her. Pierce has a friend who works the post office, she said simply. Has had for years. Letters get read before they're sent sometimes. My father figured that out after the 3rd time one of his correspondence to the land office went mysteriously unanswered. The steadiness of her, the sheer, exhaustive thoroughness with which she had been preparing for this hit, Wyatt somewhere he hadn't expected. Eleanor, he said. She looked over at him. How long have you been doing this alone? She turned back to the road. A long moment passed, full of nothing but hoofbeats and wheel sounds and wind. "Since March," she said, "when my father died and left me the journals and the key." 14 months. 14 months of this woman sitting in her house alone, reading through survey records and cross-referencing dates and watching Pierce's men walk through town like they owned it, which they mostly did, and saying nothing to nobody because there was nobody safe to say it to. Wyatt rode beside her and didn't say anything for a while. Then, you could have found someone else to bring this to, someone with more resources, a lawyer, a newspaper man from a bigger city. "I tried a lawyer," Eleanor said. "He sent me a bill for the consultation and then went quiet. The newspaper editor in Abilene was interested until someone spoke to his publisher." She paused. "I needed someone with land on the line. Someone Pierce was already targeting, who had nothing left to lose by fighting back." "You needed a rancher," Wyatt said. "I needed you," she said. "Or someone like you. As it turned out, you." It was the most direct thing she'd said to him that wasn't about documents or evidence or strategy. She said it the same way she said everything else, plainly, without decoration, but it landed differently. Wyatt looked at the road ahead. That night, after Lily was in bed, Eleanor was at the kitchen table with her father's journals when she found it. She'd been cross-referencing the boundary records again, following the chain of property transfers Pierce had engineered over 15 years, and she turned to a page near the back of the second journal, a page she'd read before, but not carefully enough, and there, in her father's small, precise handwriting, was a name she hadn't expected. She read it 3 times. Then she sat back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. "Wyatt," she said. He was in the doorway in seconds. He'd been up reading in the front room, something he'd started doing rather than going to bed at a reasonable hour, something he hadn't examined too closely. "What?" She turned the journal toward him and pointed to the name on the page. He leaned over to read it. The name was Calhoun. Not Wyatt's foreman, a different Calhoun. The journal made that clear. A Robert Calhoun listed as a clerk in the county recorder's office, dated 4 years earlier. But that wasn't what had stopped Eleanor's breath. Below the name, her father had written a single sentence: "RC, confirmed amended filings. Go through WH office without standard review. Someone inside the ranch operation has been feeding property schedules to P." Wyatt stared at the page. "Someone inside the ranch operation," he said slowly. "Your father didn't know which ranch," Eleanor said carefully. "But the timing of the entries, the properties listed around this note, they're all in this county, all in this valley." She met his eyes. "Someone on your ranch has been telling Pierce when you're behind on payments, when you're vulnerable, what your asset situation looks like." The silence in the kitchen went very hard. "I have 7 ranch hands," Wyatt said. "I know. Plus Calhoun." "I know." He straightened up. His face had gone still in a way Eleanor hadn't seen before. Not anger exactly, but something colder and more controlled, the face of a man who had learned at some point in his life that the most dangerous kind of fury was the quiet kind. "We don't tell anyone," he said. "Not yet. We don't change anything. We act exactly like we have been." "Agreed," Eleanor said. "Whoever it is, they're watching for a reaction. We don't give them one." "Agreed," she said again. He looked at the journal page one more time. Then he looked at Eleanor, and there was something in his expression that was neither the cold distance of the first night, nor the careful professional respect of the days since, something more unguarded than either of those things. Something that looked almost like gratitude, mixed with the particular kind of fear that comes from realizing how close you've been standing to the edge without knowing it. "Get some sleep," he said. "We ride to Colton's tomorrow." Eleanor closed the journal. She kept her voice even. "Good night, Wyatt." He went down the hall, his door closed. Eleanor sat at the table for a few more minutes in the silence of the house, with the journals in front of her and the name of a traitor somewhere in her new husband's household, circled in her father's handwriting. She thought about Thomas Graves, who had died believing this would never get fixed. She thought about the 14 months of evenings like this one alone. Careful patient. and somewhere underneath all that patience, terrified. She wasn't terrified tonight. She wasn't sure yet what she was instead. But it was different. She picked up the journals and carried them to her room, and she hid them in the place she always hid. Important things inside the lining of her travel case behind the false bottom she'd sewn in herself, and she lay down on top of the blanket without undressing and stared at the ceiling and thought about everything that was coming. Somewhere down the hall, she heard Wyatt's lamp go out. Neither of them slept much, and in the bunkhouse, one of the men who worked the Hayes Ranch sat awake in the dark, turning a coin over and over in his hand, waiting for morning so he could ride to the edge of the property to a spot nobody else knew about, where a man on a gray horse met him once a week and asked questions. He always answered because the money was good and the alternative was worse, and because he'd told himself from the beginning that it was just business. He was starting for the first time to wonder if he'd been wrong about that. The man on the gray horse had been coming to the same spot for 8 months. Wyatt figured that out before breakfast. He didn't say anything to Eleanor. He didn't say anything to anyone. He went out before dawn and walked the property line on the north side, the side that backed up against the creek road. The side none of the hands had reason to be on, unless they were checking the fence, and he found it within 20 minutes. A spot where the grass was worn down at the base of a cottonwood. Boot prints, 2 sets meeting from different directions. And on the ground, barely visible in the frosted dirt, the edge of a cigarette butt with a specific cut to it, the kind you bought at the trading post in town, not the rolled tobacco the hands used themselves. Someone on this ranch had been standing here. Regularly. With someone coming from the direction of Pierce's operation. Wyatt crouched down and looked at the prints for a long time. Then he stood up and walked back to the house and ate breakfast and said nothing, because Eleanor had told him correctly that the worst thing you can do when you know you're being watched is let the watcher know you know. By the time Eleanor came down, he had coffee poured and the Colton property route sketched on a scrap of paper. "We need to go today," he said. She sat down and looked at the sketch. Agreed. The letter to Marshall Holt. Gave it to Calhoun last night. Told him to write it personally to the post office in Ridgemont. He paused. Ridgemont is 40 miles out. Pierce doesn't have a man there. Eleanor looked up. "You trust Calhoun. With my life." He said it without hesitation, and then held her gaze, so she'd understand it wasn't just a phrase. "I've known Cal since I was 15 years old. Whatever that note in your father's journal means, it is not him." Eleanor nodded once. She trusted his read. She'd learned in 3 days that Wyatt Hayes was not a man who said things he didn't mean. Bert Colton answered his door with a shotgun. Not pointed at them, just held low and loose, the way a man holds a weapon when he's been expecting bad news for so long that it's become a reflex. He looked at Wyatt. He looked at Eleanor. He looked at the shotgun like he'd forgotten he was holding it and lowered it against the doorframe. "Hayes," he said. "Bert." "Heard you got married." "I did." Colton looked at Eleanor again. His expression was not unfriendly, just careful. The face of a man who had learned that new things appearing on his doorstep usually came attached to problems. "This about Pierce," he said. It also wasn't a question. "Yes," Wyatt said. Colton looked down the road in both directions. Then he stepped back from the door. "Come in then, quick." Bye. Bert Colton's story took 40 minutes to tell and was worse than anything Alderman had described. Pierce hadn't just manipulated Colton's debt, he'd gone after the water rights to the creek that ran through the Colton property, using a county ordinance about irrigation access that had been amended quietly 2 years earlier in a session of the county commission that Colton hadn't known about because the public notice had been posted for exactly 1 day in the back of the town gazette, where the livestock auction listings ran in print, small enough to require reading glasses. Without the creek water, Colton's cattle operation was hanging by a thread. He knew it. Pierce knew it. And every season, Colton held on the debt instruments Pierce held against him accrued more of those invisible processing fees, the same forged amendments Wyatt had found in his own mortgage papers. "I went to the county commissioner," Colton said. Man named Geddes. You know him. Everyone knows Geddes, Wyatt said. Geddes told me to hire a lawyer. I hired a lawyer. Lawyer spent 3 weeks reviewing my deed documents and then sent me a letter saying there was nothing actionable and that I owed him $60 for his time. Colton's voice was flat, with an anger that had been sitting so long it had turned into something harder. I found out later Pierce plays cards with that lawyer every Thursday. Eleanor, who had been listening without speaking, opened her satchel and set her father's journal on the table. Mr. Colton, she said. My father documented the Water Rights Amendment. He surveyed this watershed in 1882, and his original records show the Colton property with full creek access rights recorded under the prior county charter. She opened to the page. The amendment Pierce pushed through used a clerical technicality, a missing counter-signature on the 1879 filing. But my father noted that the counter-signature requirement wasn't added to the county code until 1881, which means the technicality didn't legally exist at the time of your original filing. Colton stared at the journal page. You're saying the water rights seizure was invalid, he said slowly. I'm saying it was manufactured, Eleanor said. The same way the debt amendments were manufactured, the same way the alderman boundary shift was manufactured. She looked at him directly. Mr. Colton, will you sign a sworn statement about what happened to you with a federal marshal, not a county official? Colton was quiet for a moment. Federal, he said. Not Geddes, not the county sheriff. Federal. We've already written to Marshal Holt in the Austin district. Colton reached across the table and turned the journal page toward him. He read slowly. His jaw worked. My grandfather built this ranch, he said. My father worked it. I've worked it for 23 years. He looked up. If I sign something and Pierce finds out before this marshal shows up, we're moving as fast as we can, Wyatt said. You have my word. Another silence. Then Colton nodded. I'll sign, he said. But I want you to know something else. Something I haven't told anyone. He lowered his voice, even though there was no one else in the house. Pierce doesn't just have the county commissioner and the card-playing lawyer. 3 months ago, I was in Caldwell, and I ran into a man I knew from the circuit court Judge Reeves's clerk. Man had a few drinks in him and said something he probably shouldn't have. Wyatt felt the room go still. What did he say? Eleanor said. He said Reeves had been made comfortable by a land investment partnership out of San Antonio. Significant money. Colton paused. I looked up that partnership when I got home. Took me 2 weeks and a favor from my cousin who works the county deed office in Caldwell. The partnership has 3 named principals. He looked at them both. Calvin Pierce is one of them. Eleanor's hand stopped moving on the journal page. Pierce has Judge Reeves, she said. Has had him for at least 2 years from what I can figure. Wyatt exhaled slowly. That's why nobody who's taken this to court has gotten anywhere. That's why nobody who's taken it to court has gotten anywhere, Colton confirmed. The judge handles all property disputes in 3 counties. Pierce doesn't need to win arguments. He just needs to make sure the man deciding them is his. Eleanor was already writing in the margin of her notepad. Fast, precise, in the same small handwriting her father used. This goes to the federal marshal, she said. Not county, not circuit. Federal supersedes Reeves's jurisdiction entirely. She looked up. But we need the partnership documents, the investment records. I have copies, Colton said. They both looked at him. He allowed himself a small, grim satisfaction at that. When you've been watching a man steal from you for 2 years, you learn to copy everything. They rode back faster than they'd ridden out. Eleanor had the Colton documents in her satchel alongside her father's journals, and Wyatt kept pace beside her without speaking. Because they'd both learned in 5 days of marriage that silence between them wasn't uncomfortable. It was functional, a shared processing space, where they each turned over what they'd just learned without needing to narrate it. It was Eleanor who broke it. "We need to deal with the spy before the marshal responds," she said. "If Pierce knows we contacted Holt—" "He might already know," Wyatt said. She looked at him. "How?" "The letter went out last night. Whoever's meeting on the north fence line might have seen Calhoun ride out." He kept his eyes on the road. "I found the meeting spot this morning, before you came down." Eleanor said nothing for a moment. Then, "You didn't tell me." "I'm telling you now." "You should have told me immediately." "I know." He didn't apologize. He just acknowledged it plainly the way she acknowledged things. "I wanted to think it through first. Old habit." She accepted that without making more of it than it was. "What's your read on who it is?" "I've been going over it all day." His voice was careful. "Process of elimination. The men who've been here long enough to know the payment schedule, the asset situation, the timing of my meetings with Pierce's people." He paused. "It narrows to 3, maybe 2. "Decker," Eleanor said. "He's 1. He had no reason to know I was going to the general store yesterday, but Pierce's man was waiting before I got there." She let that land. "Someone told him I'd be in town that morning." Wyatt's expression didn't change, but his hands tightened on the reins. "I mentioned it at breakfast," he said. "That you were going for supplies. With everyone at the table." "Yes." Neither of them said anything for a moment. "We don't confront him," Eleanor said. "Not yet. We use it." Wyatt looked at her. "We feed him something false," she said. "Something Pierce will act on. And when Pierce moves on wrong information, we'll know the channel is confirmed." She paused. "And we'll know exactly what Pierce thinks we're doing instead of what we're actually doing." It was the kind of thinking that took Wyatt a moment to follow, not because it was complicated, but because it required a level of cold patience that he wasn't entirely sure he possessed. He was a man who preferred direct confrontation. Eleanor was a woman who had spent 14 months learning that direct confrontation was exactly what a more powerful enemy wanted because it played on his ground by his rules. "What do we feed him?" Wyatt said. Eleanor thought for a moment. "Tell the table tomorrow morning that you're planning to ride to the county courthouse in Caldwell next week. That you found some paperwork irregularities and want to talk to the records clerk." She kept her voice level. "Pierce will move to block access. He'll call in a favor with Getty's, or try to have the records office unavailable. Meanwhile, we're not going to Caldwell at all." "Where are we going?" "Wherever the Mitchell family is," she said. "Harker's Junction. We get their statement. We get the Reyes family if we can reach them by post. And when Holt writes back, we give him everything at once." She looked at Wyatt steadily. "We only get one chance to move on Pierce correctly. If we go too early, he buries it. If he figures out what we're actually building." "I know," Wyatt said. The wagon rolled on. Dog. 2 days later, Lily got a fever. It came on fast, the way childhood fevers do. Fine at breakfast, glassy-eyed by noon, burning by nightfall. Wyatt knew the signs and felt the cold clench of every parent's worst reflex. He'd watched Clara nurse Lily through a fever 2 winters back, competent and calm, knowing exactly what to do. He knew what to do, too. Cool water willow bark tea. Keep her warm, but knowing and doing felt different when it was just him. It wasn't just him. Eleanor had the willow bark tea going before Wyatt finished explaining what he was seeing. She went to Lily's room, sat on the edge of the bed, felt her forehead, looked at her eyes, and her throat asked her 3 questions in the quiet voice she used when she wasn't performing calm, but actually felt it. "It's not lung fever," Eleanor said, coming back to the kitchen. "No chest sound. Her throat's a little red. She needs fluids and the fever broken by morning." She was already moving. "My father taught me cool cloth on the wrists and the back of the neck, not the forehead. Forehead cools too fast and spikes the fever higher." Wyatt watched her prepare things efficiently, without drama, without the hovering anxiety he felt vibrating in his own hands. "How do you know all this?" "My father was the only doctor substitute in our part of town when I was young," Eleanor said. "He read everything he could find on medicine and kept a box of supplies. I was his assistant from the time I was 10. She filled a basin. I've managed 3 fevers, 2 broken arms, and 1 difficult birth in the past 8 years. I'm not a doctor, but I know what I'm doing." He believed her. He believed her immediately and completely, and some of the tightness in his chest eased. He sat with Lily while Eleanor worked. His daughter was half asleep, restless, occasionally murmuring things that didn't make sense the way feverish children do. At one point, she grabbed Eleanor's hand while Eleanor was changing the cloth on her wrist and held it without knowing she was doing it, and Eleanor just let her sitting there on the edge of the narrow bed in the middle of the night with a child she'd known for 5 days holding on to her like an anchor. Wyatt saw it from the doorway. He went back to the kitchen and sat down at the table and looked at his hands for a while. He wasn't thinking about the ranch. He wasn't thinking about Pierce, or the documents, or the spy, or the marshal's letter. He was thinking about the sound of Eleanor's voice in that room, steady, low, practical, warm, and about the way Lily had grabbed her hand, and about the particular quality of that moment, the specific texture of it, which was the texture of something he had not felt in this house for 2 years. He didn't want to name it. He wasn't ready to name it. But it was there. "Boy!" Lily's fever broke just before dawn. Eleanor came out of the room and found Wyatt still at the kitchen table now with the Colton documents spread out in front of him, which was how he managed anxiety by working. "She's sleeping normally," Eleanor said. "Thank you." He said it looking up at her, and the 2 words carried more weight than 2 words usually hold, and they both felt it. Eleanor poured herself coffee. She sat down across from him. Neither of them spoke for a moment, and outside the kitchen window, the sky was doing the early gray thing it does before the sun commits. "You were thinking about Clara," Eleanor said. It wasn't an accusation. It wasn't prying. She said it the way she said factual things plainly, because dancing around it seemed more unkind than naming it. Wyatt looked at her. "Yes." "Tell me about her," Eleanor said. He didn't expect that. He'd been braced for careful avoidance, for the polite, careful navigation of a subject that everyone in his life handled like something that might shatter. Eleanor just asked, directly without ceremony, the way she asked everything. So he told her. He talked for 20 minutes about Clara Hayes, who had been funny in a quick, dry way that surprised people, who had kept every letter she'd ever received in a box under the bed, who had cried when the first foal of every season was born, and pretended she hadn't, who had been the kind of person who remembered what you'd said 3 months ago and brought it up at exactly the right moment, who had been gone 2 winters now and left a shape in this house that nothing filled. Eleanor listened to all of it. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't say anything soothing. She just listened, and when he stopped, she said quietly, "She sounds like someone worth grieving properly." He looked at her across the table. "That's a strange thing to say," he said. "Grief that's earned isn't strange," Eleanor said. "Most people rush you past it because it makes them uncomfortable. Your grief for her isn't something you need to manage on anyone else's schedule." Something moved in Wyatt's face that he couldn't quite control. "I thought," he started and then stopped. "You thought marrying again felt like a betrayal," Eleanor said. He was quiet. "I'm not here to replace her," Eleanor said. It was the same thing she'd written in her business agreement, almost word for word, except now it came out differently, not contractual, but real. "I never had any intention of that. I know what I am to this arrangement and what I'm not. You don't have to manage any of that for my sake." Wyatt looked at the table, then back at her. "You are significantly more than what I expected," he said. It came out more plainly than he'd intended. Eleanor met it with the same directness. "So are you," she said. Pierce's man came to the ranch the following afternoon. Not Calloway this time. One of the foreman, big man named Suggs, who had the particular confidence of someone who'd never had to back down from anything because he always had more men behind him than whoever he was facing. Wyatt was in the yard when the horse came in. He didn't move toward Suggs. He waited. "Mr. Pierce wants his answer on the water-sharing arrangement," Suggs said. He didn't dismount. Men like Suggs didn't dismount unless they were planning to stay, and he wasn't planning to stay. "You were supposed to have a decision by end of last week. I've been thinking it over. Wyatt said. Mr. Pierce isn't a patient man. I've noticed. Wyatt looked up at him calmly. Tell him I'll have an answer by Friday. Suggs looked around the yard. His eyes went to the house. Heard your wife's been asking questions around town. My wife asks a lot of questions. She's a teacher. It's a professional habit. Some questions make Mr. Pierce nervous. I'll pass that along, Wyatt said pleasantly. Suggs held his gaze for a moment, the kind of moment where a man is deciding whether what he's looking at is worth more pressure. Then he turned his horse and rode out. Eleanor came out of the house. I heard, she said. He was watching the house the whole time. I know. I was watching him. She came down the porch steps. He's not the one who's been meeting at the north fence line. His boots are the wrong shape, too pointed. The prints I looked at this morning have a square toe. Wyatt stared at her. You looked at the prints this morning, he said. After you told me about them, yes. She said it without apology. I went out before breakfast. You didn't tell me. She looked at him with the precise expression he'd given her 4 days ago when he'd done the same thing. He recognized it. Old habit, she said. Despite everything, despite Suggs and Pierce and the spy and the mounting pressure of everything they were building and everything that could go wrong, Wyatt almost smiled. Square toe, he said. That rules out Decker. It rules out Decker, Eleanor confirmed. Which leaves 2 others. What happened next moved faster than either of them anticipated. Calhoun rode back from Ridgemont that evening with the mail, because Wyatt had asked him to check the post office there on the chance that Holt had already responded. It was too soon for that, Wyatt knew, but he'd asked anyway. Calhoun came through the door with 2 letters and an expression that said something had gone wrong before he opened his mouth. Marshal Holt's office wrote back, Calhoun said. He handed the letter to Wyatt. That's not the problem. Wyatt read the letter. Holt had received the message. Holt was interested. Holt was sending a deputy to make initial contact within 10 days. That was the good news, better than he'd hoped. What's the problem? Eleanor said. Calhoun set the second letter on the table. It was addressed to Eleanor. No return address. The handwriting was unfamiliar. Eleanor opened it. She read it once. Then she set it down on the table, smoothed it flat with her palm, and looked at it with an expression that was controlled in the specific way that something very cold, running underneath a still surface, is controlled. Wyatt picked it up. It said, Mrs. Hayes, the school board has received a formal complaint about your conduct and fitness. An emergency session has been called for Thursday. Your position will be reviewed. You are advised that should you choose to contest this process, certain private matters related to your father's professional record may be entered into evidence. We suggest you consider what matters most to you. It wasn't signed. Thursday, Wyatt said. That's 4 days. Yes. Eleanor's voice was flat. Pierce knows about the school position. He knows it matters to you. Yes. He's trying to pull your attention off the documents. Yes. She picked the letter up, folded it, and put it in her jacket pocket. Then she looked at Wyatt with the expression of a woman who has had the path beneath her feet disappear before and knows exactly how to keep walking anyway. He wants me scared and distracted, so I won't be either. Eleanor, the school position matters, she said. I'm not pretending it doesn't, but the documents matter more. If Pierce buries those records, there's no school position worth having in this valley anyway, because he'll own everything in it. She held his gaze. We don't stop. Wyatt looked at her for a long moment. Then he looked at Calhoun, who was standing by the door, with the patient expression of a man who had decided about 10 minutes ago which side of this thing he was on. Cal, Wyatt said. I need you to ride to the Mitchell family in Harker's Junction. When? Tomorrow morning. Done. Calhoun turned his hat in his hands. Anything else? Take the youngest hand with you, Wyatt said. Leave the others here. He said it casually the way he said everything. I want the fences on the north side checked. Calhoun understood what that meant. He'd been running a ranch operation for 40 years, and he knew when a man was arranging pieces on a board. "North fence," he said. "Understood." He left. Eleanor and Wyatt stood in the kitchen in the silence after the door closed, and outside the night was gathering its particular Texas weight. And from down the hall they could hear Lily moving in her sleep, her fever completely gone, her small body doing the deep recovery sleep of a child who had come through something and landed safe on the other side. 4 days, Eleanor said. 4 days. Wyatt agreed. "We have the alderman's statement. We'll have Colton's within the week. Calhoun gets Mitchell. And the marshal's deputy arrives in 10 days if Holt moves fast," Wyatt said. "We need to be ready when he does." Eleanor was already turning toward the table, toward the journals, toward the work. "We need everything organized, cross-referenced, dated, presented in a form a legal authority can act on immediately." "How long will that take?" she calculated. 3 days if we work every night. Then we start tonight." She sat down. He sat down across from her. The lamp was between them, and the document spread out across the table like a map of everything Calvin Pierce had done and thought he'd gotten away with. And Eleanor Graves Hayes opened her father's journal to the first marked page, and Wyatt Hayes pulled the forged mortgage amendments toward him, and they went to work. Neither of them said anything about what had been said in the kitchen before dawn, about Clara and grief that was earned and what Eleanor was and wasn't in this arrangement. Those things were said, and they sat between the two of them, the way true things do not, requiring repetition, not going anywhere. In the bunkhouse, a man with square-toed boots lay awake staring at the ceiling, and in the morning he would be gone before anyone noticed, which would tell Wyatt Hayes everything he needed to know, and begin the most dangerous week of both their lives. The bunk was empty before sunrise. Wyatt found it when he walked through the bunkhouse at first light, not checking, just moving through his morning routine, the way he always did, but his eyes went there automatically to the corner bunk, with the square-toed boots that had been sitting beside it every morning for 4 months. The boots were gone. The bedroll was gone. The man's name had been Hess, quiet competent, hired on during fall roundup, and he had left sometime in the dark without saying a word to anyone, which said everything. Calhoun was already in the yard when Wyatt came out. "Hess," Wyatt said. "Noticed," Calhoun said. "He ran." "Ran to Pierce, most likely, to warn him." Wyatt looked at the sky. The sun wasn't fully up yet, maybe 2 hours before the world started moving. "How fast can you get to Harker's Junction and back?" he said. "If I ride hard 2 days." "Go now. Get Mitchell's statement today. Don't stop anywhere between here and there." Wyatt turned to go back inside. "And Cal, if anyone asks where you're headed, you're looking at a bull to buy in Ridgemont." Calhoun was already moving toward the stable. Eleanor was at the kitchen table when Wyatt came back in. She'd been there most of the night. The documents were organized into 3 stacks, each one clipped with a strip of leather and labeled in her precise handwriting. She looked up at him, and he said 2 words, "Hess ran." She nodded once, absorbed it, and went back to what she was writing. "The school board meeting is tomorrow," she said. "Thursday. I have to go." "I know. I know what you're going to say." "Do you? You're going to say it's a trap. That Pierce set up the meeting to pull me into town and away from the documents." She set down her pen. "You're right. It is a trap. And I'm still going." Wyatt pulled out the chair across from her and sat down. "I wasn't going to tell you not to go." She looked at him, slightly surprised, just slightly. "Those are my students," Eleanor said. "That school is mine. I built the curriculum from nothing. I convinced the board to extend the term 2 months. I brought in books from my own shelves." Her voice was steady, but there was something underneath it that wasn't. "If I don't show up, they take it without a fight. And I will not give Calvin Pierce anything without a fight." "I'll come with you," Wyatt said. "That's what I was hoping you'd say." The school board meeting was held in the back room of the county assessor's office, which told Eleanor everything about what they expected it to look like. A quiet official disposal. Four men in good chairs deciding the fate of a woman who was supposed to come in, accept their verdict, and leave without making it unpleasant. There were 5 board members. 3 of them looked at Eleanor when she came through the door with the particular expression of men who had rehearsed their certainty and were now slightly unsettled by how direct her gaze was. The 4th was Harriet's husband, the dry goods store man, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. The 5th was Geddes, the county commissioner, who had no business being on a school board and was there entirely because Pierce had put him there. Wyatt sat in the back of the room. He didn't speak. His presence was the point. The board chairman, a man named Fowler, who ran the feed mill and considered himself a pillar of the community, largely because nobody had contradicted him on it, opened a folder and read from a prepared statement about professional conduct, moral character, and community expectations. Eleanor let him finish. Then she opened her own folder. "Gentlemen," she said, "I have here a letter from the Texas State Education Office confirming that my teaching certificate is current and in good standing. I have attendance records showing that student performance at this school has improved 31% over the past 3 years under my instruction. I have a signed petition from 42 parents, including several of yours, requesting that my position be continued." She set each document on the table as she named it. "And I have a letter from an attorney in Austin, noting that the termination of a certified teacher's contract without documented cause and due process constitutes a breach of state education code, which opens this board to personal liability." The room went very quiet. Fowler looked at Geddes. Geddes looked at the table. "Mrs. Hayes," Fowler said carefully, "the complaint filed against you was filed anonymously," Eleanor said, "through Mr. Pierce's attorney's office as it happens, which I believe disqualifies it under Board Procedure Section 4, which requires complaints to be signed by a named community member." She looked at him steadily. "I looked up the procedure. It's in the founding charter, which I've read because I teach the children of this community, and I believe in understanding the rules of the institutions that govern their lives." Fowler's mouth opened, closed. Geddes finally spoke. "Mrs. Hayes, there are concerns about your recent activities that go beyond the classroom." "My recent activities," Eleanor said, "include caring for a sick child, managing ranch accounts, and supporting my husband's property interests. If any of that concerns you, Mr. Geddes, I'd be interested to hear the specific nature of the concern." Geddes said nothing. Eleanor closed her folder. "I'll expect written confirmation of my continued appointment by end of week. Good afternoon." She stood. She walked to the door. Wyatt held it open for her. They walked out together, and she didn't look back, and behind them the room was so quiet you could hear Fowler breathing through his nose. "Chog." They were halfway down the street when Wyatt said, "The attorney letter." "I wrote it myself," Eleanor said. "I studied the state education code for 2 nights. The letter is accurate." "You wrote a letter from an attorney you don't have." "The content is legally accurate. If they call the bluff, I'll find an actual attorney to confirm it." She glanced at him. "I was running a risk. Sometimes you have to." Wyatt looked at her sideways. Something that was definitely almost a smile. "You terrify me slightly," he said. "Good," she said. "That means you're paying attention." They found the deputy marshal waiting at the ranch when they got back. He was sitting on the porch steps drinking coffee that Decker had apparently provided, which surprised everyone, including Decker. His name was Reyes, no relation to the ranching family. He clarified immediately. A compact, watchful man in his 30s, who had the quiet authority of someone who spent most of his professional life in rooms where people were lying to him and had gotten very good at recognizing the difference. "Marshal Holt sends his regards," Reyes said, standing when they came into the yard. "He would have come himself, but there's a situation in Abilene. He asked me to make the initial assessment and report back." He looked at Wyatt. "Your letter was specific enough that he moved the timeline up." Wyatt shook his hand. "How much do you know?" "Enough to ride 40 miles without stopping." Reyes looked at Eleanor. "You're the one who compiled the evidence." "Yes." "Can I see it?" Eleanor took him inside and spread everything on the table. The forged mortgage amendments, the survey journals with her father's records, the cross-referenced boundary data, the alderman statement, the Colton documents, including the investment partnership records linking Pierce to Judge Reeves. Reyes read for 40 minutes without speaking. When he finished, he looked up. "This is enough to open a federal investigation," he said. The forged documents alone combined with the pattern across multiple properties that establishes a racketeering case. The Judge connection makes it bigger. He paused. "The partnership records on Reeves, these are originals." "Copies my father made from the county deed filing," Eleanor said, "with his certification stamps on each page. His stamps were legally recognized instruments." Reyes tapped the Colton documents. "And Colton will testify." "Yes, Alderman also. And we're waiting on the Mitchell family. My foreman is en route now." Reyes was quiet for a moment. He had the stillness of a man running calculations. "I need to get word to Marshal Holt tonight. We need to move before Pierce knows the federal case is active. Once he knows, he'll start moving assets and destroying records." "He already knows we've been gathering evidence," Wyatt said. "One of my hands was feeding him information. The man ran 3 days ago." Reyes absorbed that without visible alarm. "How much does Pierce know specifically?" "He knows we've been visiting other ranchers. He knows Eleanor has her father's journals. He doesn't know about you." Wyatt paused. "Or he didn't until Hess ran. I don't know what Hess knew about the Marshall contact." Reyes stood. "Then we have hours, not days." He looked at both of them. "I need to send a wire to Holt. Is there a telegraph in this town I can trust?" "No," Eleanor said flatly. "Pierce has an arrangement with the telegraph operator." "Ridgemont," Wyatt said. 40 miles east." "I'll ride tonight," Reyes said. "I'll be back by morning with instructions." He started toward the door, then stopped. "Mrs. Hayes, the documents, where are they stored?" "Separately," Eleanor said. "Not all in one place. If something happens to any one location, the others survive." Reyes looked at her with the expression of a man who has worked with informants and witnesses for 15 years and can recognize when someone has been doing this correctly. "Smart," he said, and meant it. Reyes was barely an hour down the road when Pierce made his move. Not through Calloway this time. Not through Suggs or a hired foreman. Pierce himself rode to the Hayes Ranch, which was the first time he'd done that in 2 years of holding their mortgage, and the fact that he came personally told Wyatt everything about how frightened the man had become. Pierce dismounted in the yard. He didn't wait to be invited in. He walked to the porch and looked at Wyatt like a man reasserting the natural order of things through sheer confidence, because confidence had always been enough before. "I know about the surveying records," Pierce said. "I know about the other ranchers. And I know you wrote to someone in Austin." He paused. "I'm here to settle this before it becomes something that hurts everyone." Wyatt didn't answer. "I'm prepared to forgive the entire mortgage debt," Pierce said. "Free and clear. The deed transfers back to you today, no conditions. Additionally, I'll sign over the water rights currently held in the Colton arrangement. Colton gets his creek back." Pierce's voice was steady, but there was something under it that hadn't been there before, a tightness like a rope with too much weight on it. "Everyone walks away whole. Nobody has to go through what a federal investigation does to a community. The disruption, the uncertainty." "What do we give you?" Wyatt said. "The journals," Pierce said. "Eleanor's father's journals, and whatever copies have been made." Wyatt looked at him. "That's all?" "That's all." The word all hung in the air between them, because they both knew it wasn't all. It was everything. It was 14 months of Thomas Graves's careful documentation. It was Alderman's signed statement, and Colton's copies, and the investment partnership records, and the forged amendments. It was the only proof that Pierce had done what Pierce had done, not just to the Hayes Ranch, but to every family he'd pushed off their land for 15 years. "I'll need to speak with my wife," Wyatt said. Pierce nodded. "Of course!" Wyatt went inside. Eleanor was standing in the kitchen doorway. She'd heard every word. "Don't," she said before he could speak. "I know." "He's scared. Scared men make offers. But the offer disappears the moment we hand over the journals, and then there's nothing. No record, no case, no protection. Her voice was low and absolute. And 3 months from now, he starts again. Different names, different properties, different families. I know, Wyatt said again, so you know what you need to tell him. Wyatt looked at her for one moment, this woman who had carried this for 14 months alone, who had walked into a forced marriage with a folder of legal agreements and a plan she hadn't told him about yet, who had faced down a school board and a land baron's attorney, and a room full of people who'd spent years deciding she wasn't worth their respect, and he felt something clarify in him, the way water clarifies after sediment settles. He went back outside. No, he told Pierce. Pierce's expression didn't change, but something behind his eyes did. Something cold and calculating and final. Mr. Hayes, Pierce said, think very carefully. I have, Wyatt said. The answer is no. Pierce looked at him for a long moment. Then he mounted his horse and rode out of the yard without another word. No threat, no ultimatum, just departure. Which was worse, because men like Pierce didn't leave without a plan. They left because the plan was already in motion. Calhoun rode in at dusk with the Mitchell statement in his jacket. He handed it to Eleanor at the kitchen table, and she added it to the stack, and for a moment, the three of them, Eleanor, Wyatt, Calhoun, stood around that table looking at everything they'd built, and it was enough. It was more than enough, and the marshal's deputy was riding hard to Ridgemont and would be back in the morning, and everything was as in order as it could be. Then they heard the horses. Not one horse, multiple, coming fast from the North Road. Wyatt was out the door before anyone spoke. The North Road led to town. 3 riders moving at a pace that wasn't casual, pulling up hard in the yard. One of them was Bert Colton, which was wrong because Colton had no reason to be here at night. Pierce's men hit my ranch this afternoon, Colton said before his horse finished stopping. 3 of them. Took every document I had, went straight to where I kept things like they knew. His jaw was tight. They knew, Wyatt. Someone told them where I kept my papers. Wyatt went very still. Hess, Calhoun said quietly from the porch. If Hess knew about the Colton visit. He knew, Wyatt said. He was in the barn when we came back that day. Colton dismounted. My signed statement, I have the signed statement, it was on my person. They didn't get that. But everything else. He looked at Eleanor through the door. Are your father's journals safe? Eleanor had come out onto the porch. Yes. Then we still have a case, Colton said. But Pierce knows we're moving. He's going to do something tonight. I'd bet my life on it. He was right. They just didn't know yet what form it would take. Wyatt rode out at 9 o'clock. He didn't tell Eleanor where he was going, which was a mistake he recognized the moment he made it, but made anyway, because what he was planning was something Eleanor would have argued against with complete logic and complete accuracy, and he didn't have the time or the patience for a conversation he agreed with, but couldn't follow. He rode to Pierce's property, not to the house, to the office building Pierce maintained on the east edge of his ranch, the one where the real paperwork was kept, the one Eleanor's father had marked in his journals as the location of the original forged filing documents. If those originals still existed, they were there. And if Reyes came back tomorrow with a federal warrant having the originals not copies originals, would make the case airtight instead of merely convincing. He got within a quarter mile when they hit him. 2 men from both sides of the road at once, the way you do it when you've been waiting. He heard the first shot before he felt it, the sound preceding the impact, the way it always does, a fraction of a second that feels much longer. And then the world tilted sideways, and he was on the ground, and his horse was gone running, and the men were riding away already because they hadn't come to finish the job, they'd come to send a message. He lay there in the dark for a while. The shoulder, high through the muscle, painful and serious, but not fatal if he could get somewhere warm and get it clean. He knew gunshot wounds the way men of his generation knew them, not from medicine books, but from experience from the 2 times before this. He'd been on the receiving end of bad decisions made by other people. He tried to stand, got halfway there, sat back down. The horse was gone. Eleanor knew something was wrong at 10 o'clock when the feeling in the house changed. She couldn't have explained the logic of it to anyone who asked. She just knew the way you know certain things when you've been paying close attention to a person for enough days in close enough quarters that their absence becomes a specific shape rather than a general fact. She found Calhoun. "Where did he go?" she said. Calhoun looked at her. He was not a man who lied easily to people who looked at him that directly. "Pierce's East office," he said. "I think." She was already getting her coat. "Get the horses." "Eleanor." "Now Cal." They found him 40 minutes later, sitting against a fence post on the East Road, with his hand pressed to his shoulder, and his jaw locked against the pane in the specific way that meant he was furious at himself and holding it completely inward. Eleanor dropped from her horse before it stopped. She knelt beside him and moved his hand and looked at the wound in the dark with the focused efficiency of a woman who had done this before, and what she felt was many things. Simultaneously fear, anger, something desperate and fierce that she was not going to name out loud right now, but what her hands did was completely steady. "Through and through," she said. "Yes." "Can you stand with help?" "Yes." "Calhoun, take his other side." They got him up. Got him on the horse, Calhoun behind him to hold him steady. Eleanor mounted and took the lead, and they moved fast, not talking because there was nothing to say right now that mattered more than getting him back. Lily was standing in the kitchen doorway when they came in awake in her nightgown, with her rag doll in her arms, and she looked at her father's shoulder and at Eleanor, and she didn't cry, which told Eleanor that this child had already seen enough hard things to know that crying came later after the emergency was handled. "Go back to bed, sweetheart," Eleanor said. "Papa's going to be fine, I promise." "I want to stay," Lily said. "I know, go." Lily went. Because Eleanor's voice when she said something that way made you feel like disobeying it would be the wrong kind of thing to do. She was halfway through cleaning the wound when they smelled the smoke. Not smoke from the fireplace. Smoke from outside, from the wrong direction, wrong thickness, wrong speed coming through the walls. Calhoun was out the door before either of them spoke. He came back in 10 seconds with 2 words, "The barn." Eleanor stood. "Stay," Wyatt said. His voice was sharp and it cost him. She looked at him. Really, looked at him the way she looked at things she needed to understand fast. And what she calculated in that fraction of a second was shoulder wound, through and through. No arterial involvement. Bleeding controlled, he was not going to die from this wound in the next 10 minutes. And then she heard Calhoun shouting Lily's name from outside. Everything in her went cold. She went to the stable. Calhoun's voice came through the wall. She said she was going to check the horses. "Lily." Eleanor ran. Wyatt tried to stand and made it to the doorway and held the frame and watched her go. Eleanor running across the yard toward the barn where the fire had caught the south wall and the smoke was pouring out the upper gaps, running without slowing, without hesitating, without any calculation at all. Now just movement. She went through the barn door. The hands outside were trying to get the cattle out through the north side. Calhoun was at the door calling into the smoke. Wyatt stood in the house doorway with his hand on the frame, and his heart doing something it had no business doing, in a chest that was already holding a bullet wound, and he watched the burning barn, and he counted. He counted to 30 before Eleanor came back through that door. She had Lily on one arm, the child with her face pressed against Eleanor's shoulder, coughing, but alive, completely alive. And with her other hand, she had hold of a terrified horse's halter, and she walked that horse out of a burning barn, talking to it low and steady, the same voice she used with students and fever-sick children, and ambushed husbands, the voice that said everything was going to be manageable if you just kept moving. She got the horse clear. She handed Lily to Calhoun. She turned back toward the barn. "Eleanor," Wyatt said, his voice carried across the yard. She stopped. She turned and looked at him. "Don't," he said. And something about the way he said it, not commanding, Not panicked, something rawer than either of those made her stop. She stood in the yard with the fire roaring behind her, and she looked at Wyatt Hayes in the doorway of his house, and she stayed. The barn burned. The hands worked the bucket line. Calhoun held Lily, who was coughing and crying now, the way she hadn't allowed herself to before. And crying was fine because crying meant she had enough air for it. And Wyatt Hayes stood in his doorway, looking at Eleanor Graves Hayes. And he understood, with the particular clarity that only comes from nearly losing something, that the woman he had not wanted to marry had become the person he could not imagine his life without. He didn't say it. Not yet. The yard was chaos, and the barn was burning, and his shoulder needed stitching, and the federal deputy was coming back at dawn. But he understood it. And when Eleanor walked back across the yard toward him, covered in smoke, and completely steady, she met his eyes and held them, and whatever she saw there, she didn't look away from. "I told you to stay inside," she said when she reached the porch. "You didn't listen when I said stay either," Wyatt said. She looked at him for one more second. Then she put her hand under his good arm. "Come sit down," she said. "I need to finish what I started." He sat. She finished. And neither of them said what the night had clarified, because they were both people who needed things to settle before they named them, and there was still so much left to do. But something had changed. Something permanent and irreversible, the way things that go through fire always are. Deputy Reyes rode into the yard at first light with 4 men behind him. Wyatt heard the horses from inside the house where Eleanor had finally made him lie down on the front room settee 2 hours before dawn, after she finished stitching the shoulder wound with the same precise, unsentimental efficiency she brought to everything. He heard the horses, and he was up before Eleanor could tell him not to be moving through the pain, because the alternative was lying there while things happened without him, which was not something Wyatt Hayes was constitutionally capable of. Reyes came through the door without knocking. He took one look at the bandaged shoulder and the set of Wyatt's jaw, and didn't mention either. "Marshal Holt authorized the warrant at midnight," Reyes said. He put the document on the kitchen table. "Federal warrant for Calvin Pierce fraud, forgery, racketeering, conspiracy to deprive citizens of property rights under federal land statutes. Judge Reeves is named separately. The Austin Circuit is handling Reeves independently. Different judge, different jurisdiction. Nothing Pierce can touch." He looked at Eleanor. "The investment partnership documents you pulled from Colton, those were what made the Reeves case. Without those, we had suspicion. With those, we have evidence." Eleanor looked at the warrant on the table. 14 months of her life. Her father's journals, 2 forged signature comparisons, 3 ranchers' statements, and a dead man's careful handwriting had come down to a single signed document that gave federal officers the right to walk through Calvin Pierce's door. "Where is he?" she said. "His ranch," Reyes said. "We ride in 20 minutes. Wyatt was already reaching for his coat. "You're not riding anywhere," Eleanor said. "Eleanor, you have a stitched bullet wound less than 8 hours old, and I used the last of the clean linen on it." She stood in front of him. Not blocking his way, she knew better than to physically obstruct this man on a morning like this. Just standing there, meeting his eyes, making her case with nothing but the directness of someone who was right and knew it. "If that wound opens on horseback, you could bleed out before anyone notices. And I am not—" She stopped, steadied. "I need you to still be alive when this is finished." The room was very quiet. Reyes was studying the warrant document with intense concentration, which was his way of not being present in a moment that didn't belong to him. Wyatt looked at Eleanor. At her face, which was controlled in the way it was always controlled, but had something in it this morning that the professional composure didn't quite cover, something that had been there since she walked out of that burning barn holding his daughter. "I'll take the wagon," he said. "Calhoun drives." Eleanor looked at him for one more second. Then she stepped aside. "Calhoun drives," she said. "And if you start bleeding, you tell him to stop." "Yes, ma'am," Wyatt said. It was the first time he'd ever said that to her. She registered it and said nothing and went to get her own coat. They rode into Pierce's property with the kind of authority that doesn't need to announce itself because the numbers say everything. 6 federal officers, 2 warrants, and the weight of the United States government moving at a canter down a Texas road at sunrise. Pierce was in his office when they arrived. His man Suggs tried to slow things at the gate, which lasted approximately 30 seconds before Reyes showed him the warrant, and Suggs stepped aside with the expression of a man recalculating his future employment. Wyatt stayed in the wagon because he had told Eleanor he would. He watched from the yard. Pierce came out of the office between 2 federal officers, and the first thing that was apparent was that he had already known this was coming. Not the exact hour, but the shape of it. He was dressed. He was composed. He came out walking like a man who intended to maintain his dignity regardless of what was happening to him. Because dignity was the last currency he had, and he was not going to spend it in front of people who worked for him. He saw Wyatt in the wagon. He looked at him for a long moment. "You should have taken the deal," Pierce said. "No," Wyatt said. "I shouldn't have." Pierce looked at Eleanor standing beside the wagon. Whatever he'd expected from the school teacher, he'd tried to use as a pawn, whatever he'd calculated when he put her name on that piece of paper and slid it across his desk. 16 weeks ago, it was clear from his face that this was not it. Eleanor met his gaze and held it and said nothing, because there was nothing that needed saying. The warrant said it. The 4 federal officers said it. Her father's journals safe in the lining of her travel case back at the ranch said it. Pierce turned away first. They put him on a horse and rode him toward town, and by the time they reached the main street, word had gotten there ahead of them, the way word always does in a small place. And the people of that town came out of their houses and their shops and their offices and stood on both sides of the street and watched Calvin Pierce ride past in federal custody on a Tuesday morning. The same people who had filled the church for Eleanor's forced wedding. The same women who had whispered behind lace fans. The same men who had smirked at the altar. They all stood there and watched. Geddes, the county commissioner, resigned by noon. He sent a written notice to the county board and did not come out of his house for 3 days, which the town interpreted correctly as a man waiting to see how far the federal investigation reached before he decided whether to cooperate or run. He eventually cooperated. Completely. He had the specific enthusiasm for honesty that men develop when they realize the alternative is sharing a cell with the person they worked for. The school board met on Friday. Eleanor was not summoned this time. They sent a letter instead. Formal, careful, written in the language of institutions, performing accountability, confirming her appointment, and noting that the previous complaint had been reviewed and found procedurally invalid. Fowler, the board chairman, added a handwritten line at the bottom that said, "The board recognizes that your service to this school has been exemplary. We regret any disturbance." Eleanor read the letter at the kitchen table with Wyatt across from her. "Exemplary," he said. "It took them considerable effort to write that word, I imagine," she said. "Do you feel vindicated?" She considered this seriously the way she considered everything. "I feel like we can get back to work," she said, "which is better than vindicated." That was Eleanor. That had always been Eleanor. Our Meg. Bert Colton got his water rights back on the 11th day after Pierce's arrest. The federal review of the county water ordinance took less time than anyone expected, partly because the amendment Pierce had pushed through was so badly constructed legally that even the county's own attorney couldn't defend it. Once Geddes stopped backing it, and partly because Eleanor's cross-reference of the original survey records was so airtight that the reviewing officer told Reyes it was the clearest property documentation he'd seen in a federal case in 8 years. Colton rode to the Hayes Ranch when the papers came through. He shook Wyatt's hand. He looked at Eleanor. "Your father," he said. "He deserved better than what happened to him." "Yes," Eleanor said. "He did. But he raised someone who finished what he started." Colton turned his hat in his hands. "That's not nothing, Miss Eleanor. That's not nothing at all." Eleanor didn't answer. She didn't need to. But Wyatt, watching from the porch, saw something move across her face in the moment Colton said her father's name. a grief she had been carrying so correctly and for so long that it had become structural part of the load-bearing wall of who she was. And for just a second, it moved like something releasing pressure. He filed that away. He had been filing things away about Eleanor for weeks, building a complete account of who she actually was. Not who the town had decided she was, not who Pierce had tried to make her, but the real woman. The one who woke before dawn and kept 2 cups of coffee out of habit, and taught ranch children about the constellations, and ran into burning buildings without calculating whether to. He knew who she was. He had known for a while. He'd just been waiting for the right moment to say it out loud, and he was waiting because he wanted to say it correctly, and because he was a man who did not use words carelessly. Calhoun found the first thing. He was clearing the north fence line, the real work this time, not a surveillance exercise, and in the hollow of the cottonwood, where Hess had met Pierce's man for 8 months, he found a tin box buried under 6 inches of dirt. Inside the tin box were copies of documents Hess had photographed or transcribed, ranch schedules, debt amounts, Wyatt's correspondence, and underneath those, a payment ledger, cash amounts, dates, and a name that wasn't Pierce's. Calhoun brought it to Wyatt without opening it further. Wyatt looked at the ledger. He turned to the last page, read the most recent entry. Then he went still. The name was Calloway, Pierce's attorney. But the payments listed under Calloway's column weren't for Hess. They were for Judge Reeves. The direct cash payments from Pierce's investment partnership to the judge's personal account, hand-delivered by Calloway, documented here in amounts and dates that matched exactly what Eleanor had already established from the partnership records. But there was a second column, a second recipient, a name that Wyatt recognized as the county deed clerk, the man who had been processing Pierce's amended filings, who had been accepting the forged documents and recording them without standard review, as Eleanor's father had written in the margin of his journal over a year ago. Eleanor's father had written R.C., Robert Calhoun, the deed clerk, not Wyatt's foreman. Now they had his actual name. Wyatt brought the ledger to Reyes, who was still in town coordinating the federal case. Reyes looked at it for 3 minutes. "This completes the chain," he said. "Pierce to Calloway to Reeves and to the deed clerk. Every forged filing, every fraudulent amendment, we can now trace each one through this payment record." He looked at Wyatt. "Where did you find this?" "In the ground on my property," Wyatt said, "where Hess was meeting Pierce's man. He must have been holding it as insurance, in case Pierce tried to cut him loose." Reyes shook his head slowly. "Hess probably didn't know what he had." "No," Wyatt said. "He didn't. He thought about the man who had sat in his bunkhouse for 4 months doing his work, adequately eating at the same table as the other hands, and feeding everything he saw to a man who used that information to squeeze families off their land. He thought about the tin box in the hollow tree. He thought about what kind of fear makes a man keep insurance buried 6 inches underground on someone else's property. He almost felt something like pity. Almost. Then he thought about the night his horse rode back alone, and Eleanor running into a burning barn, and he put the ledger in Reyes's hands and walked away. Lily started calling her Mama Ellie on a Thursday. Not announced. Not deliberate in the way children sometimes make a ceremony of deciding things. It just happened the way things happen when they've been moving toward each other for long enough, naturally, as if it had always been true, and the word had simply been waiting for permission. Eleanor was reading to her by lamplight. Halfway through a chapter, Lily said without looking up from the page, "Mama Ellie, what does resolute mean?" Eleanor was quiet for one breath. "It means you've decided something, and nothing is going to change your mind," she said. Lily considered this. "Like you." "Maybe," Eleanor said. "Like a lot of people when something matters enough." She kept reading. She didn't make anything of the name. She didn't stop or react or change her voice. She just kept reading the same steady pace, the same lamplight, the same page. But her hand, which was resting on the edge of Lily's blanket, closed gently around the child's small fingers and stayed there until the chapter was done. Wyatt heard it from the hallway. He stood there with his hand on the doorframe. the same door frame he'd stood at weeks ago, watching Eleanor sit on the floor of his house, reading his daughter's father's mortgage documents by firelight. And the feeling in his chest was the same feeling he'd been refusing to name since approximately the third night of this marriage, except now it was so large and so obvious that refusing to name it had become genuinely absurd. He went to the kitchen. He put water on for coffee. He stood at the stove and thought about what he was going to say and how he was going to say it, because he was a man who took words seriously, and he did not want to get this wrong. Eleanor came into the kitchen after Lily was asleep. She poured coffee without asking if he wanted it because she had learned in 6 weeks of marriage exactly when Wyatt Hayes was about to have a significant conversation. He put water on and then stood at the stove, looking at it like it owed him something. She sat down across from him. He said, "I kept trying not to." She waited. After Clara. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. Loving someone again felt like I was saying that what I had with her didn't cost me what it actually cost. Like the grief was counterfeit. He looked up. Every time I noticed you really noticed you, I felt guilty about it. Like I owed her my unhappiness. Eleanor said nothing. She let him say it completely. "She wouldn't have felt that way," he said. "Clara. She wasn't that kind of person. She would have told me exactly what she thought, which was that wallowing is a luxury, and Lily needs a parent who's present, and life is too short to spend it apologizing for still being alive." He paused. "She would have liked you. That's the thing. She would have liked you considerably." Eleanor looked at him across the table. "How do you know?" "Because she only ever liked people who didn't waste her time," Wyatt said. "You have never wasted a minute of anyone's time in your life." Something moved in Eleanor's face. Not the professional composure, not the controlled steadiness, something underneath that something that had been there from the beginning and had been getting harder to contain for the last 2 weeks. "Wyatt," she said. "I'm not finished," he said. "I've been working up to this for 16 days and I need to say it completely." She waited. "I didn't want to marry you," he said. "I want to be honest about that because you were honest with me from the beginning, and you deserve the same. I walked into your house that morning because I was desperate, and you were the name Pierce put on a piece of paper, and I thought—" He stopped. "I thought it best we'd make a workable arrangement. That was the ceiling. That was all I was hoping for." Eleanor was still. "I was wrong," Wyatt said. "About the ceiling, about what was possible, about what you were." He looked at her steadily the way she looked at things directly without flinching. "You walked into this house and you fixed the accounts, and you sat on my floor reading forged mortgage papers at midnight, and you kept my daughter's fever from getting worse, and you wrote a fake attorney letter and stood in front of a school board, and you ran into a burning barn for a child you'd known for 3 weeks. He paused. "And somewhere in the middle of all of that, I stopped trying not to notice you." Silence. "I love you," he said. "I don't know when exactly it became that specific, but it's that specific now. And I thought you should know." Eleanor held his gaze. Then she said, "I know." He blinked. "I know," she said again, quieter. "I've known for a while. I was waiting for you to catch up." And then, because she was Eleanor, and honesty was not a habit, she kept selectively, "I love you too. I didn't intend to. I intended a practical arrangement with clear terms and minimal emotional complexity." She paused. "You were considerably more than I accounted for." "I terrify you slightly," he said. His own words reflected back. "You do," she said. "That means I'm paying attention." He looked at her across the kitchen table. His kitchen, his table. The house that had been full of absence for 2 years and was now full of something else entirely. And he reached across and put his hand over hers, the way they'd reached for each other at the altar 6 weeks ago. Same timing, same instinct. Except this time, it wasn't about the people watching, and it wasn't about making it through the ceremony. It was chosen. Completely and deliberately chosen. The Harvest Festival came on the last Saturday of October, the way it always did. The whole valley came the way it always did. Except this year, it was different, because the last 6 weeks had been different, and everyone in that town understood by now what had happened and what it meant and who had made it happen. The Alderman family came back for the first time since they'd sold out. The Colton family came with the particular ease of people who could breathe again. The Mitchell family drove 40 miles for it. Reyes came too. He was technically on his way back to Austin, but he took the long road. Wyatt stood in the town square in front of the church where 6 weeks ago he'd stood at an altar waiting for a sentence. Lily was beside him wearing her best dress and holding Eleanor's hand. And when Eleanor had come downstairs that morning, Wyatt had looked at her in the simple way a man looks at a woman, when the looking itself says what words spend a long time trying to get to. The town was there, all of it, the same faces. Wyatt didn't make a speech. He was not a speech-making man. He simply turned to Eleanor in front of all of them, and took her hands and said what he had to say loudly enough that the people who needed to hear it couldn't pretend they hadn't. "They forced me to marry you," he said. "I want everyone here to know that. They forced me and I did it, and it was the best thing that ever happened to me. Not because it worked out, because of who you are, because of what you did with a situation neither of us wanted." He looked at her. "You didn't just save my ranch, you saved this valley, and I'm going to spend whatever time I have left making sure you never doubt for a minute that you are exactly where you belong." The square was very quiet. Eleanor looked at him with those steady eyes that had never once flinched from anything. "I was never in doubt," she said. Lily between them put one hand in Wyatt's and kept the other in Eleanor's, and looked up at both of them with the calm satisfaction of a 7-year-old who has been waiting for the adults around her to catch up to what she already figured out 3 weeks ago. "Can we get pie now?" she said. Wyatt laughed a full real laugh, the kind that comes from somewhere unguarded, the kind that had not lived in this man for 2 years and was apparently back now and intended to stay. Eleanor covered her mouth with one hand and did not entirely succeed at not laughing also. "Yes," Wyatt said. "We can get pie." The Hayes Ranch deed came back clean on the first day of November, cleared by federal order, every fraudulent amendment stricken, every forged signature, nullified the property, returned without condition to Wyatt James Hayes and Eleanor Ruth Hayes, equal partners under the law. Wyatt held the paper for a long time before he put it in the strongbox. Eleanor watched him from across the room and said nothing, because this moment belonged entirely to him, to the man who had nearly lost his family's land, who had stood on his porch in the dark, counting what remained, who had made a desperate deal on a morning he thought was the worst of his life, and had been wrong about that too. He put the deed away. He closed the strongbox. "It's done," he said. "It's done," Eleanor said. Eleanor reopened the school the following Monday. She rebuilt the curriculum from her father's books and her own, and she opened the doors to ranch girls and immigrant children and the sons of field workers who had been told for years that the school was for other people's children. She taught reading by lamplight to widows who had never learned. She taught arithmetic to grown men who were embarrassed to ask. Wyatt built her a library that spring, small, solid, with proper shelving and a window that faced east for the morning light. He built it the way he did everything carefully, without making a production of it, showing up one morning with lumber and finishing 3 weeks later without ceremony. On the shelf above the door, Eleanor put her father's journals. All of them. Not hidden, not locked away. There. Thomas Graves had spent 30 years writing down the truth, and his daughter had spent 14 months making sure it counted. And now the journals sat in a room where children learned that the truth was worth the work of keeping it. Lily grew up calling her Mama Ellie, and meaning it in every way the word can mean something. And Eleanor Graves Hayes taught the children of that valley for 22 more years. And the town that had once dismissed her as an old maid never quite recovered from the particular embarrassment of having been so completely, so publicly, and so permanently wrong. The woman they had written off as unwanted had turned out to be exactly what the valley needed, and the man who had been forced to marry her had turned out to be exactly the kind of man willing to admit that the best thing that ever happened to him had come wearing practical boots and carrying a forged mortgage document and showing up at his door in the most ordinary way with the most extraordinary consequences. They had been pushed together by greed and desperation and a land baron who thought human beings were pieces on a board. But what they built together every morning, every deliberate choice, every word said plainly across a kitchen table, was theirs, chosen completely and irreversibly. And that, in the end, is the only kind of love worth having.